Unit 6, Civil War and Reconstruction. Chapter 16, Civil War. Lesson 3, Hardships at Home. What was the Texas home front like during the Civil War? Terms to know: home front, the civilian war in wartime. Homespun, a coarse, loosely woven homemade fabric. Quinine, the drug used for fighting malaria and other fevers. Collapse, to break apart or fall down suddenly. Women in the Civil War effort. The 107th U.S. Infantry. Lincoln's assassination. The Texas home front. Guiding question: what was the Texas home front like during the Civil War? After secession, pro-Confederate leaders quickly took control of state offices in Texas. Edward Clark replaced Sam Houston as governor. Clark's successor was Francis R. Lubbock. He was elected governor in 1861 after having served as lieutenant governor. Lubbock was a lifelong Democrat and was involved in state and local politics. As governor, Lubbock helped raise troops for the Confederacy and encouraged the growth of Texas factories to make military supplies. When his term ended in 1863, he joined the Confederate Army. Pendleton Murrah became governor and held the office until the end of the war. The war greatly affected the home front, or the civilian world, in wartime. These effects included a scarcity of goods caused by the Union blockade, a struggling economy, the need for women, children, and enslaved workers to do most of the farm work during the war while the men fought, the need for women to do the jobs usually done by men, as well as the ones they had previously done. Some wealthy women helped poorer families, others helped the soldiers. They cared for soldiers in their homes, turning sheets into bandages and providing comfort and food to the returning soldiers. The economy of Texas changed during the Civil War. Shortages of war supplies and food influenced how farmers and industries in the Confederacy did their work. Small factories in Austin and Tyler were opened to manufacture weapons and ammunition for the war effort. Southerners had to find ways to produce other war supplies, such as saddles, shoes, tents, and blankets. Women often formed groups to make these goods. Obtaining cloth was a major problem. Before the war, much of the cloth sewed in the South was manufactured in the North. When war broke out, the South was not prepared to manufacture cloth. Instead, women wove a coarse, loosely woven fabric called homespun in their homes and used it to make clothing. This cloth replaced the machine-made fabrics from the North. Basic food products such as coffee, tea, and flour were also in short supply. Instead of cotton, farmers were encouraged to grow corn and wheat to feed soldiers and civilians. Some Southerners became sick from the lack of healthful food. There were other major shortages. Newspapers stopped printing due to a shortage of paper. Medicines were also hard to obtain on the home front because most medical supplies went to the military. For example, a drug called quinine, used to treat the disease malaria, was scarce. Southerners tried to find substitutes, but this was difficult. The lack of medicines and the unhealthy conditions of the war allowed diseases to spread quickly. The war ends. Guiding question: what led to the end of the Civil War? In the end, the Confederacy could not overcome the Union's advantages, including a larger population and more industry. In April 1865, Union troops entered Richmond, Virginia, the Confederate capital. The Confederate government fled, but President Jefferson Davis was captured. Union troops then surrounded General Robert E. Lee's army at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. On April 9, 1865, Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. Despite the surrender of Confederate armies in the East, nearly a month after Lee's surrender, General Edmund Kirby Smith declared that he would keep fighting. Smith commanded all Confederate forces west of the Mississippi River, which included Texas. As a result of Smith's refusal to stop fighting, the last battle of the Civil War took place in Texas. Union forces believed that the Confederates were withdrawing from Brownsville, so they sent a force to investigate. However, the Confederates were not withdrawing, and the two forces met. After a brief fight, both sides pulled back and waited for reinforcements. More troops arrived, and the two sides clashed again in the Battle of Palmetto Ranch in May 1865. Neither side was able to win until the Confederate cavalry arrived. The Union soldiers could not withstand the cavalry and retreated. The battle resulted in only a few casualties, but more than 100 Union soldiers were captured. A few days later, Confederate governors in Texas and nearby states advised General Smith to end the fighting. Palmetto Ranch became the last battle of the Civil War. The aftermath of the Civil War was challenging for the Confederacy. Many in the South had died and property was in ruins. State governments were able to perform only the most basic functions. A huge change was that the South could no longer depend on enslaved labor. On January 1st, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This declared that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. At the time, the proclamation could not be enforced in most of the Confederacy, but abolition became a major Union goal. Then, just 5 days after Lee surrendered to Grant, President Lincoln was assassinated. His killer, John Wilkes Booth, believed he was helping the Confederate cause. Instead, the nation was forced to adjust to a new president at a difficult time. President Andrew Johnson had the huge task of reuniting the country. As Confederate armies surrendered, the Texas state government collapsed. Governor Murat and other state officials fled to Mexico to avoid capture by Union forces. This left the state with no government. Groups of armed men attacked citizens. To restore order, President Johnson named Andrew Jackson Hamilton as provisional governor of Texas. Hamilton was a Unionist and a Democrat. During the war, when his life was threatened because of his support of the Union, he had fled to Mexico. Then he toured the North, giving speeches critical of the South and slavery. In the North, he was a hero, but to most Texans, he was a traitor. It would be many years before the South was rebuilt and the nation fully reunited. Still, the war was over, and soldiers could return to their homes in Texas.